Hey guys, Frosted Knives here with a quick update. The video you're about to watch, in that video I made a mistake. I incorrectly said that Stephen King's accident, where he got hit by a van, was on July 19th, 1999. The correct date is June 19th, 1999. So I thought I would give you a quick fix update. Now, enjoy the video. Hey guys, Frosty Knives here, back with another video, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to just do a video and talk about Stephen King's career and talk about the different impacts of his career, the different stages of his career. I had mentioned in another video that there were three distinct stages of Stephen King's career and where his career shifted and his writing shifted, and I just want to talk about that. This is going to be really informal. This is not going to be real specific details. A lot of the specific details of Stephen King's career are going to be, it can be found out there. But this is going to be more of a broad strokes overview of what I think are my thoughts on his decades-spanning career and the shifts in his career. Something I had been thinking about. So we're just gonna talk about it. I'm just going to let you know some of the different things that, as a person who has grown up with Stephen King, who has just been a big figure in my life because he started writing and I started reading. I mean, I lived through all of his career, so I think that'll also be a little interesting. So, Stephen King started writing short stories, right? That's where he started his career. He was writing short stories, most of which can be found in Night Shift and Skeleton Crew. Those were his early short stories. He wrote a lot of them. He wrote them primarily in adult men's magazines, publications like Playboy, Cavalier, Atom, things like that. He didn't have a lot of money when he started writing. He was an English teacher, just married, just out of college. And he used it to supplement his income. In one interview I read by him, he stated whenever he needed something, like an electric bill needed to be paid, or his kid needed medicine or something like that, he'd write another story and he'd sell it. So he wasn't making a lot of money. He was writing a lot of short stories. He was publishing a lot. He wasn't really making a lot of money. And then his career in novels, that started, as we all know, that started with Carrie. The book that almost never made it, right? This was a book that almost never saw the light of day. Stephen King started to write Carrie. He intended it to be a novella, never really intended it to be a novel. He got 3 pages in, wrote 3 pages. Apparently he hated it, threw it away in the trash. And Tabitha, in the first, might be the first, I'm not sure, but in the first that I know of many times where she has saved a book, pulled it out of the trash and read it and told him, you need to finish this. You need to write this. This is good. And offered to help him with the female perspective on Carrie. So he wrote it. And Carrie was his first published novel. And it did well. As we all know, Carrie was a hit. And it very soon spawned a movie with Sissy Spacek. Also a hit. And so that started what I call the big 3 of Stephen King's career, right? So he published Carrie, and it did really well. Made some money, made a good movie. I think Carrie was a good movie. And then he published Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot did really well. He made a lot of money. Spawned a nice miniseries, which is what I saw. That's how I was introduced to Stephen King, was by the miniseries, Salem's Lot. And then I read the book. And that did really well. And then we get to the third of the big 3. Then he publishes The Shining. And his agent at the time, I read, told him, he said, you're going to get, the conversation he laid out was, you're going to get typecast if you keep doing this. And Stephen King said, well, what do you mean I'm going to get typecast? And he says, well, you published a story about a psychic girl. You published a story about vampires. Now you're giving me a story about a haunted hotel and a kid with powers. You're going to get typecast as a horror writer. And Stephen King made a comment to that, something about, well, there could be worse company that I could be in if that's the case. He didn't really care, right? So he published The Shining. And from there, it was history, right? It was just a phenomenal history. That's the big three, I think, that really just nailed his name on the market. And then we've got the Kubrick movie of The Shining. But that set him off on a trajectory. The late 70s and the rest of the 80s, Stephen King was just on a roll. It was literal hit after bestseller, and movie. It just kept coming. Christine, Pet Sematary, Dead Zone, in no particular order. The Stand, everything he did in the 80s and the late 70s and 80s, that first half of his career, it was gold. He was making bestsellers. He was making money hands over fist. He was making, people were chomping at the bit to make movies out of his books. It was just, the King machine was rolling. And whether you liked him or hated him, whether you thought he was a hack, or whether you thought he was a great writer, whether you read him, whether you didn't read him, whatever, it was undeniable that in that time period, King was virtually untouchable. You could not touch him. The King of Horror, they were calling him, right? He had the best name in the world. The King of Horror. You could not touch Stephen King in the 80s. No one even came close to touching King when it came to horror. And he just kept going. And the money flowed in, and the money flowed in, the hits flowed in, the movies flowed in, and other things flowed in, right? And this is where the addiction started happening, right? The alcohol, the drugs, the cocaine. He had a lot of money. He was riding high through the 80s, figuratively and literally riding high. And I think when you get thrust into that kind of fame immediately like that, where you go from a sort of a low income, small town teacher, wannabe writer, right? When you go from that to just the name on the marquee, when you become that untouchable, it kind of changes you. And if you have addictive personalities or addictive tendencies, that's gonna come out, because now you've got the money, and now you've got the friends, and now you've got the parties, and now you're in that thing. So the 80s was his breakthrough, was also where most of his addiction happened, and it was riddled all over his writing, right? Everything that he wrote in the 80s, every book that he wrote was in some way, shape, or form touched by his addiction, or touched by addiction. You can find just about in every book, there is a character in that book that is addicted to something, right? Carrie had her mom had a religious addiction. Jack Torrance from The Shining, alcoholic. There were addicted characters in The Stand. Christine was all about obsession and addiction. The whole book was about Arnie getting addicted to his car. Pet Sematary, addiction, right? Lewis was getting addicted to the power of the cemetery. Every single book that he wrote in the 80s was touched and tinged by addiction, until it got so bad that it really started impacting his writing. Towards the tail end of the 80s, it really started crawling its way into his writing. That started with Misery. Misery is a phenomenal book. It's also a metaphor, a giant metaphor for addiction. And King is Paul Sheldon, and Annie Wilkes is his addiction. Annie Wilkes is a personification of Stephen King's addiction. He made comment in an interview where he said that Annie Wilkes was my addiction, that was my addiction, because no matter what he tried to do, he couldn't kick the addiction. It was his number one fan. It was going to keep coming after him. And that was Misery. And that's the first time where I think the writing, the addiction really started to grab the writing. And then it kept crouching in. The addiction kept crouching in. It flavored all of it. It flavored all of Misery, flavored all this stuff, until finally we get to Tommyknockers, and just out of control addiction by this point. And it's so clear in all of the writing of Tommyknockers. It's just out of control. James Gardner is out of control. Bobby Anderson is out of control. Every single character in Tommyknockers is out of control, and so isn't Stephen King. He's out of control. He's spiraling at this point. It's so bad, he's spiraling. And I really think that Tommyknockers was his cry for help. I really do, because that whole thing was a spiral, just like his addiction. And that was the last book that he wrote when he was in the throes of his addiction. That's right after Tommyknockers was when they made an intervention. That concluded the first half of his career. That's when his career first shifted. Was right after Tommyknockers. And he had an intervention. He went to rehab. He got cleaned up. Didn't publish a book for 2 years. Really cleaned himself up. So the first half of his career was just was phenomenal. It was great. As a person who lived through it, I couldn't wait for the next King book. I knew it was going to be gold, and it was. They all knew. Everybody knew it was going to be gold. The publishers knew it was going to be gold. And that ended at Tommyknockers. And then there was a hiatus. And then there was a shift. So after he got clean, and after he went into rehab, got clean, and everything, the first book he published after that started the second shift of his career, was Dark Half. And it was good. It was a really good book. It was The Death of a Pseudonym, right? It was The Death of a Pseudonym. And then he published the revised edition of The Stand. And then he published The Wastelands. And then he published Needful Things, where he destroyed Castle Rock. It's almost as if King was burying the last vestiges of his past life, right? He wrote a story where he had a pseudonym who was bad news, right? In the Dark Half, George Stark was bad news. So he killed it off. Killed him. Dead. And then he took one of his oldest towns, Castle Rock, in Needful Things. He took that, and he blew it up, destroyed it, dead. It was almost like he was taking his old life, the vestiges, the remnants of his old life, and saying, that's over, that's done, we're finished, I'm going to bury it. And he buried it. In his writing, he buried it. And then he started writing. He started a good period. This is a good section of his writing. He started cranking out good books, but they were different books. They were books that King was not generally known for, right? We got Gerald's Game. We got Dolores Claiborne. We got Rose Madder. We got The Green Mile came out this time. And they were books that weren't common for King, because they weren't horror books. They were books about people doing evil things to other people. That was a shift. That was different, but they were still good. His writing was good. It was no longer really about addiction, but it was stripped out. It was clean. It was good writing. It was really great characters and stuff. And his writing had tightened up. It was really good writing he was putting out. And there were other books that people would question, right? Because Insomnia came out at that point. People were like, well, Insomnia is a little weird. And it kind of is, but it's still good writing. It's a more mature King. It's a more mature, clean, tightened up King that we got. And he just wrote some really good stuff. All of those books were good, and they were new. And we got We got 4 Past Midnight, which is an excellent set of novellas, just phenomenal. We got Nightmares and Dreamscapes, another great short story compilation. And it just looked like his writing he was good, he was clean, he was back in the groove again. He was writing some good stuff. And he wrote Wizard and Glass. That was the 2 King books that Dark Tower books that he wrote during this period was Wasteland and Wizard and Glass. He was taking good chunks of time in between each of the Tower books to really write them. And things were good. Things were going really well for King. Until he had a second intervention. Intervention number 2. Only this time it was an intervention from fate. And then July 19th, 1999, that's a date that many constant readers will know about. July 19th, 1999 was the day Stephen King got hit by a van, almost killed. This is when his writing and his career shifts again. This is his, like I like to call it, his second intervention. Only fate or the Tower, somebody is intervening, trying to get rid of King. And that was a bad one. That was when he thought that we could have lost King. We almost lost King on that date. And that's when things kind of went into limbo, and that's when things shifted. That's also when Stephen King, that's what started Stephen King from using the number 19 as a symbol of power in his later writings. 19 starts cropping up, especially in the Dark Tower series. Crops up elsewhere, but that's when it really starts cropping up. That's when he intentionally starts focusing on the number 19. It's because of that date. It's because of July 19th, 1999. There's a lot of 9s in that. He started using that. And it's funny, here's a little aside about that. It's funny, that's when he started writing characters whose names, the letters in their names started adding up to 19. He started doing this intentionally, right? Donald Frank Callahan and Ted Brodigan. I forget what Ted's middle name was, but if you look up Ted Brodigan, his name equals 19. Donald Frank Callahan, he added the Frank to it. His name adds up to 19. That's when he started playing with the number 19. And it was because of that date. But here's a funny little aside to that. Go back decades and many books later. Go back to The Shining and The Dead Zone. 2 books that were written years before his accident. Years before he started intentionally using the number 19 in his writing. Years before that happened. Go back to those 2 books in his early career, and here's something that may or may not blow your mind. In The Shining, the room that Danny is afraid to go in with the dead woman in the tub, the haunted room, the room that no one goes in, that's room 217. If you add up 2 and 17, you get 19. And in The Dead Zone, the last number that Johnny Smith plays on the Wheel of Fortune, the last bet he makes, is 19. And that sends him into the Dead Zone. After that, he gets into his coma and he goes into the Dead Zone. So, I don't know. A little bit of fate traveling backwards. Who knows? Maybe 19 is just a number that's a favorite number of Stephen King. Try not to read too much into it. But it's interesting. Every new book that Stephen King puts out, every new character, I count the letters in the names to see if they add up to 19. So that, sorry about that, a little shaky shake. So that was the second half of his career. This is the second shift where he was hit by the van and he had his accident. Then we get into the third stage of his career, which was from then until now, until current. It's the rest of his career. The first book he wrote that started that section of his career off was Dreamcatcher. A lot of people don't like Dreamcatcher. I like Dreamcatcher. He wrote Dreamcatcher the old-fashioned way. He wrote it when he was in rehab. He wrote it with pen and paper. Longhand. He wrote it longhand. That's how he wrote that giant tome of a book. Dreamcatcher. This giant tome of a book he writes longhand. And it was a little wonky. Of course, he did have some, he was on some Valium and some painkillers, and there were some drugs involved. They were legal drugs. They were part of his, and a lot of people say that they don't like Dreamcatcher. They say Stephen King can't really write science fiction. I like Dreamcatcher. It was the first Stephen King book that I read where I laughed out loud through the book, because who's not going to laugh at shit weasels? I'm just saying, you're shitting out weasels, and this imagery was just, to me, fucking funny. So I did enjoy Dreamcatcher. But this sends King on the rest of his career, right? And this is where we're at. We had Dreamcatcher, then we had, Lisey's story and Duma Key and Under the Dome. Everything out that came out since Dreamcatcher were here. But what's notable about this, and where you can really see the shift in his writing, is with The Tower. This is when he publishes bang, bang, bang. Dark Tower 5, Dark Tower 6, Dark Tower 7. He just shotgunned them out. And he said when he was in rehab, when he was in the hospital, he still was getting and reading his fan mail, and somebody wrote to him, and he said, I'm sorry to hear that you had an accident, but when I heard that Stephen King had an accident and he might die, he said, that the fan said, the first thing that I thought of was, oh God, the tower is going to fall. What's going to happen to the tower? And Stephen King realized that the tower was so important to fans and to him that he had to write it. So he really focused on the tower. Previously, the books were coming out years apart. The Gunslinger and Drawing of the Three and The Wastelands and Wizard and Glass, they came out years apart. Just years apart. And he said that he didn't start a new Dark Tower book until he got into the move, until he could find his way back into the book, and that was his muse or his impetus. And so that's why there were such long stretches in the beginning of the first 4 books, because he was just getting back. He's waiting for the tower to call him back. This time, he decided, he's like, I have to finish the tower, and I have to get it done. That's why 5, 6, and 7 read differently than the first 4 books. That's why there's a shift from the first 4 books to the rapid pace of 5, 6, and 7. That's why they came out fast. That's why he wrote them fast. And we can debate whether or not that was a good idea or a bad idea. We can debate whether or not that was a good move or a bad move, whether or not those books were good books or bad books. We can debate that till the end of time. But what you can't debate is there is a marked shift between Dark Tower 1, 2, 3, 4 and Dark Tower 5, 6, 7. It's almost like someone else wrote 5, 6, 7 compared to 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a shift. Even when you read them, go back and read the Tower books, 1 through 7. Read them back to back to back to back. You're going to see the shift. There's a shift. There's a feel. There's a shift between 4 and 5. That's why I read Wind Through the Keyhole between the two, because it's kind of like a palate cleanser. It's like okay, I know we're shifting here. That's where you can really see his shift. His writing is still good. His writing is even more mature, because he's even more mature. Now he's writing about characters who are in the latter half of their lives, right? You write what you know. So when he was in the 80s, his characters were youngish, and then when he was in the second half, his characters were middle-aged. Now a lot of his characters, like in the Mercedes trilogy, can't remember the cop's name. Maybe my memory is slipping. A lot of his characters now are older characters. So he's winding down now. Now he's winding down, and he's still writing, and he's still got ideas, and there's still some snoozers in what he's writing. Not everything that he's writing now in this stage of his career is a hit. Not everything. Even though it is actually bestsellers, they're not all good, you know? The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, Cell, Elevation, Sleeping Beauties. They're not all ballpark winners, but and that's where we are now, where he's winding down, and now we anticipate a King book, and it's not the same anticipation that I had when it was the 80s. In the 80s, it was like, I gotta get this because I know this is gonna be phenomenal. I was riding the high with King, vicariously riding the high with King, reading his books as it came out, reading them, rereading them, watching the movies. I was right there riding the high with him through his literature. And now that he's winding down, now I don't run out and get the book. Billy Summers is out now, and I will get it and I will read it. I don't know if I'll buy it, but I got it on hold in my library. When it comes in, I'll read it. But I don't chomp at the bit anymore to go read a Stephen King book. I don't have that need anymore. Maybe my addiction to Stephen King books is broken, and is normal now. Maybe now I've finally had my own personal intervention. So that's all I wanted to talk about Stephen King's career, because I think it's fascinating, and I think we could have a dialogue on this because there's so much to talk about, right? But there's your broad shifts. I think that's your broad overview of a nice overview of King's career, and that's not comprehensive. This is not a comprehensive overview. People could and most likely will teach books on King, all kinds, literature books, history of King books, his life, his career, his stories, his addiction. They'll do it. People will teach classes on King because it's fascinating. And as someone who lived his career, right? Because I was born in '73. I'm dating myself. So I lived his career. Carrie came out in '77. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. It was late '70s. I think Sam's Lot came out in 1980. So Carrie came out in '77, I think. Somewhere there. So I lived his career. I grew up literally with King, and it's fascinating to watch someone that influential emerge, grow, pitfalls, ups and downs to where we are now. And when King passes, a good chunk of my life will pass with him. A good chunk of what I was as a kid in the teen, a good chunk of all that will pass with him, because he's so entwined. He's so part of the culture. He's so entwined with people, with the culture. His name is so synonymous with horror. That he's like the Michael Jackson of horror. Like, he's just part of Americana, of the culture of us. Whew, that was a 28-minute video, but I felt like I wanted to do this. So if you stuck around, you're a trooper. Thank you for sticking around and listening. And like I said, we could talk about this ad nauseum. The dialogue on this could go forever, because there's so much to talk about, and there's so many different perspectives to talk about it from. So guys, that is my broad overview of the career, decade-spanning phenomenal career of Stephen King. Hope you liked it. Like I said, I wasn't going to go into the specific details because you can find that, but I hope you liked my thoughts on his career. Whoo! So there we are. So thank you for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for making it all the way to the end. And as always, if you like it, subscribe, share it around, tell your friends, tell your enemies. And until next time, I will see you in another videos.